So there was a post a while back about how it might be nice to see a short making of for one of these assets that I was responsible for during the Quixel Mixer beta, the Mixer 2020 beta. Um, During that time, I wanted to showcase some of the feature set of the Mixer 2020 software um, with a project that I hadn't seen before. And one of the major benefits of the software is how you can transform the look of an asset relatively easily. And I really liked the Icelandic rock scans that Quixel had done, and I knew I wanted to work with one of those assets. And I had always wanted to work on a snow shader or like an ice shader or something like that, do an ice or snow material. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to kind of do that so I could develop an interesting ice or snow material and then also try to do a reskin of an asset and showcase some of the features of the Mixer 2020 software. So this is what I ended up doing. This is just kind of like, this is something that I did sort of like over the course of an evening because I was mostly focused on iterating through the different features of the software during beta and trying to help the beta team. And this is what it looks like before. This is what it looked like after I finished skinning it. And I was just going to step through kind of some of that process and show how I approached that. I'm not editing this video or anything like that, so there's not going to be the same type of polish that you might expect from like a tutorial. This isn't a tutorial. It's just meant to kind of show what my process was like, and maybe that'll be informative or helpful for someone down the line. So anyway, the first thing is to start a mixer. So this is actually the current version of Mixer. So this is the one that you'll get from the official Quixel website as of March 15th, 2020. And this is 2020.1.0. So right now I am displaying the textures in 2K, and that's because Quixel Mixer is quite good at managing 2K texture sets. Once we get into 4K texture sets, you may experience some slowdown, and this is a high poly asset, and for the sake of the recording, I don't really want to take any chances with that. So this is a high poly mesh. Basically, when you set up your project, there are a lot of tutorials that will be coming out about Quixel Mixer, ones that may already be available, but essentially you can just choose a 3D asset type and it will prompt you to choose something from the library. I chose the Icelandic rock assembly, and it'll import the LOD group that you've selected. And so we have this mesh, and so really, again, I wanted to kind of turn this into this kind of glacial, frozen ocean color. I wasn't really going for something realistic. I was going for something sort of stylized, like an exaggerated look. And keep in mind that the entire time I'm working on this, I'm always thinking that ultimately I'm going to end up in Corona, and once I get into Corona, I can kind of make the material look pretty much however I want. So for example, to start, I add this sort of snowy, rocky ground material, and using the hotkey 9 on the number row, you can view the mask. So this is where that material is being applied on this mesh. And so it's basically going mostly on the ground. So I'm trying to just set this sort of foundation here. And by pressing hotkey 1 on the number row of the keyboard, I can go back into the PBR view, PBR metallic view. And so you can see it's cropping up here a little bit. After that, I wanted to kind of cover this in snow to kind of give me a base to work with. And by holding down the shift key and the right mouse button, you can kind of rotate the light around here. Now, just as a note for anyone that ends up working with Quixel Mixer, something that I did not realize initially, but I think is super, super important, is that the Mixer viewport, it gives you the option to look, to view your asset with image-based lighting, and they include some different HDR images to light the scene. But what isn't obvious necessarily is that there's also a light. There's actually a physical light in this viewport that's casting these shadows that you can see here. That's not coming from the HDRI. That's coming from a light source. So there's a light source in here, excuse me, and you can adjust that light source. Now, hopefully in the future, Mixer will include additional parameters for camera post-processing, the physical light intensity, attenuation, fall off, and stuff like that, or maybe gamma exposure settings for the IBL, but right now it doesn't. And I just want to point that out because when you see this right now at like 0.9, this is blown out, super blown out. And so you have to really dial it back so you can get a good read on the whites and the blacks, etc., and the grays in your scene. So that's just a note. But anyway, so I applied this white material here to kind of give us a base to work with. And again, by pressing 9 hotkey on the number row, you can see where that's kind of going. And so if you look on the right here, if you're new to Quixel Mixer, each one of these layers, and again, this is not meant to be a tutorial, so I'm not going to go into depth here, but essentially I have a mask stack, and this stack is allowing me to configure where that actual material shows up. So right now I have a curvature mask on here, which is putting it everywhere that you see white, and then a gradient remap, which is kind of creating this posterization effect where it goes into these sort of layers within itself. And I have a blur, which gives me this really, really beautiful sort of sandblasted rock look, because we're taking this sort of fractal, or this sort of like what is it called, this stepping, and then blurring it, and so it's creating these streaks, and this is actually a directional blur, and so it's doing that. In the future, I'd really like to return to this and do kind of a gradient remap with some kind of dusty Arizona colors and do something with that, but for now I wanted to do that, but with a blue, like a kind of a glacial color. And so I kind of went back and forth with that, and eventually I was just like, okay, let's just do this instead, and I returned to that later on. And so right now I'm putting this sort of snow here on the top, and I'm using a position gradient to do that. And so the position gradient, you know, you can move this around to kind of adjust where it appears, like this, and you kind of get how that works. So I'll turn that back on, turn off our mask. And then now here's a new material. This is another sort of rocky, snowy ground, and I'm layering it on top of this one to kind of thicken up the look of this base here. I don't want it to look so gravelly. I want it to look more like snow gravel, like it's caked, it's thick with snow, because again, I can turn this into a pretty interesting shader later on in Corona. And so once this sort of foundation is set here, where I feel like I've got this sort of gravel snow mound look creeping up the bottom of this, and again, this is all procedural so far. I'm not hand painting anything at this point. Once I've got that established, I want to work on this actual kind of rock formation. And so this is sort of the meat of the project, and I knew I wanted to do this sort of like oceanic, thick Powerade blue to kind of hype up or like amp up the style of what you normally see with like an ice shader. And so I looked through a bunch of different color schemes, and I kind of settled on this kind of deep aquamarine glacial blue color. And you can see the mask here. Again, I'm using some position gradients and a blur, and so it's going basically all the way down into the base of this rock formation. Now I'm doing a little bit of kind of trickery here, where I think I'm actually multiplying a position gradient on top of this, because right now with the base of my mask stack, the position gradient, it's going too far. I don't want it to affect so much of the ground. So I added another position gradient on top and then multiplied it, and it cuts out a lot of this material here. And kind of nice, there's some Photoshop hotkeys inside of Mixer, so if I alt-click on this, it'll alt-left-click on this, it'll show me just that one. And then I blur it so it looks a little bit more natural. And so that's where you can see this, where this blue material is showing up. Now, one of the things I would point out about this is that remember that I have a snow material, this fresh snow material. I have that active on this part of the mesh here. And so if I turn this off, you can see this is all white. This is that snow material. And so this mask here, it's actually leaving, there's some black here on these edges. You can see this black here. And again here, there's a little bit of black. And of course, on this edge here. And wherever there's black, this material is not going to show up. And that's important because with these type of frosted snow materials, there's this translucency through the edges. When the edges get thin, this is a pretty common effect that you see with ice. And I had a little bit of experience working with a material like this in the past back when I used to do some real-time stuff, and you would have to kind of fake this. And so I thought that if I kind of faked it here, when I put it into Corona, it would exaggerate that look even more, and I thought it would look kind of nice. So because the volumetric shader in Corona is already going to do that for me automatically just by changing the volume depth and so forth. But I wanted to kind of amp that up, include a stylistic choice here that might amp that up. And so then I'm taking this sort of light blue, this light pale blue, and I'm putting a position gradient to put it on just this part. I think I copied and pasted it from the mask below, and then a curvature mask so that it only goes onto these edges, and then I tighten up that curvature mask so it affects these edges really strongly. And what you get is this sort of effect where you have this kind of streaky pale blue on the mesh around the edges. And again, I'm thinking, having worked with the volumetric shader with Corona quite a bit before, I'm thinking, well, this tiny bit of blue here, if I use this as a mask later on, it's going to really amp up where that appears. It's going to look pretty exaggerated. And then I just take one step further here with this kind of green pale blue with another mask, and I take this position gradient to control where it goes. Again, I'm copying and pasting from the first one I showed you a couple moments ago, and a curvature mask to put it onto the edges, a blur, and again, this is actually a directional blur, so it's kind of got this wind-blown sort of effect to it where it's going in a single direction, and then a brightness contrast to tighten that up because I want it to look kind of sharp. And so this is kind of what you get. Now you can see, especially here, where it goes from this deep glacial blue into this light pale blue and ultimately into the white around the crevices. This wasn't meant to be something for a portfolio. It was really just experiments to see what I could do. And this was early on in the beta too, so I was pretty happy with these results. It's an interesting looking asset, not production ready or anything like that, but it's kind of it was a fun experiment, in which that was what it was supposed to be. So again, the whole time I'm thinking about how once I get this material, it's going to go into Corona, and once it gets into Corona, I can manipulate it beyond what's possible here in the mixer viewport, or what I might have inside of a real-time engine or something like that. And so I just export the texture set. At the moment, Quixel Mixer supports a direct export into Quixel Bridge. If you haven't used Quixel Bridge, it is honestly an even more amazing software than Quixel Mixer because it integrates with just about every DCC application that's available. It takes so much of the legwork and opportunity to make mistakes when configuring your shader out of the hands of the end user. It does a lot of legwork for you so that you can kind of focus on creativity. And so I'm not going to do that here, but that is an option where you could export a material from Quixel Mixer directly to Bridge, and then from Bridge directly to Max. I did it manually in this case. So if we go into Max, this is the asset here. I think this is actually the high poly mesh, but the UVs are preserved, so I just bring in that high poly mesh from Bridge, and then I go about creating my material. I'm just gonna tone this down because it's bothering me. And so basically what we have is this diffuse map. This is the albedo that comes from Mixer. We have a glossiness map, a normal map, and then a color correct from the diffuse map that's going into the volumetric scatter. So again, I wanted to create this kind of oceanic glass looking material. Excuse me. And so I went and cranked up the refraction and turned up the refraction glossiness, and then increased the volumetric scattering distance, and then piped in a color corrected version of the diffuse map into the volumetric scatter. And then I also did a color correct on the diffuse map itself and passed that into the diffuse color. So really this map here, this color correction of the diffuse map, and then this color correction of the diffuse map are controlling the major color representation of the surface here. And so one is going to the diffuse channel, one's going into the volumetric scattering color. And this is kind of what you get. So I'm a little hesitant to do this, but I do want to show you. So let's just do a region selective here, clear the rest of the VFB. I think right now, I think I have, yeah, the fast preview denoiser is on. So mind the blurriness, but it should allow us to iterate a little bit faster. So if we go into this color correct map here, which I use the Corona color correct basically always. I know most people, or I think a lot of people use the default max color correction, but I just prefer the terminology of the Corona color correct. So here, it looks like I'm not actually doing anything to this one. So I misspoke. It's actually this one that's being manipulated, and it looks like I'm doing a couple things. One is I'm cranking up the exposure. So you can see by cranking up the exposure, it's increasing that sort of those transparent edges, or that sort of glowing subsurface appearance of the material. And man, those highlights are really bright. And then I also am doing a gamma adjustment. So here I'm cranking up the gamma, which is just enhancing that sort of color representation through these sort of edges where the scattering color is being represented. And you know, if we look at the final thing I did, it was kind of just like I think the expression slipshot or something like that, where I kind of slammed it together. I think this backdrop is actually of Hoth from Star Wars. I think I just pulled it from the internet. And then, you know, I just exported this out with the alpha. It's already got a black background, and then just kind of put it together in Photoshop. So here we have this background. I'm doing a little bit of color correction on it. And then I have the main render, and I'm doing some hue sat and color adjustment on it, and then this is what you get. So definitely nothing mysterious. It was an interesting surface. I'm happy with the way it turned out, given that it was an experiment. I really like the blue and the subsurface representation, this sort of a light pale blue green as this deep oceanic color. And something that I really liked, it was sort of a happy accident, was these parts here, which got some of that mask, or I guess they got some of that volumetric treatment and that refraction. They actually look sort of like shiny, fresh glacial ice. And you can see it here where it just goes right through it. And obviously I can't speak for how other people perceive this sort of asset, but to me it looks sort of like a frozen wave or something like that, and I thought that was kind of cool. So that's it. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I'm happy to try to answer them. Thanks.